The judge looked down at me and said, "Dr. Murphy, you're accused of non-compliance with the Selective Service Act." I had come with my father from an adjoining state to the federal court. The judge then followed that by saying, "How do you plead?" I arose and said, "Your Honor, I plead guilty as charged." It was as if a thunderbolt had struck down, and I now began my life as a felon. So what was it that brought me to this state of affairs? Many of you can remember it was something called the Vietnam War. This is a small country in Southeast Asia, and it grabbed all of us at that time by the heart and squeezed hard. I'll tell you about one episode. It's called the My Lai Massacre. This is where a platoon of American soldiers went into a village to look for Viet Cong, but instead they eliminated the entire village, and over a 24-hour period of time killed every living thing in the entire village. Next, we protested, but as we were protesting, 2 states over at a place called Kent State, people were protesting just as we were, and the National Guard came out and opened fire on the protesters. 5 were killed. What should be your response to something like that? Worse than that, one day I picked up the New York Times and I saw in bold headlines, "The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a fabrication." This was an incident that was used to increase the number of troops in Vietnam by 500,000 more soldiers. So this was almost a call for sedition by the most respected newspaper in the United States, the New York Times. We protested. We were active. May Day, 1970, 1 million of us marching in Washington, D.C. We had a plan. As soon as the National Guard and the troops came out, we would convince them to join us. They were us. These are Americans just like we are. We couldn't quite pull that one off. Had we been able to do that, the government was ours. We would have made a huge difference. This is what brought me to the courthouse. At that time, you didn't have any choice. Your number would come up. When it came up, you had no choice. You go. Well, I decided I would follow my conscience, and I could not participate in this activity. After that, what do? I'm a young doctor. Am I looking for a position of monetary reward, happiness? No, didn't enter into the equation. I am upset with the world. I am angry. I am frustrated. I am, people would even say, rebellious. Enter the equation, Cesar Chavez. Who is it that feeds America? Well, it turns out that our food comes from agribusiness industry around the United States, but a lot of it in California. And the work is done by undocumented workers with absolutely no rights, exploited every move on the way. And there was a young Chicano labor organizer named Cesar Chavez who was starting to organize these most desperate workers. He was looking also to form a medical clinic, so that's where I went. The work was very dramatic and very rewarding, but also it became dangerous, very frustrating, and Cesar Chavez was an advocate of the policies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Nonviolent. What turned out after several years, as the movement gathered strength and people were going on strike and ruining the sugar content of grapes, it turned out that 2 workers were killed on picket lines. That's when Cesar Chavez announced, okay, we're stopping the strike. All of us were crushed. But in the next breath, he said, but we'll be starting a nationwide boycott. And this is where things became very dramatic. Farm workers were sent to every city in the United States to organize at the grassroots community level a boycott of non-union grapes. At the same time, there was going to be a presidential election. Our good friend in Sacramento, Jerry Brown, decided to run for president. He and Cesar Chavez were the best friends. Jerry Brown was a friend of our clinic in California. And he exploited this network of farm workers around the country to build a machine that could not be stopped. He was winning primary after primary, and he was like no other candidate. He would have changed things not just for farm workers, but for Americans and probably around the world. However, in the last week of primaries, he was beaten by Jimmy Carter. So from there, I had to decide where to work next, because without Jerry Brown, it was much more difficult to organize. At the time, Portugal had given independence to all their colonies. Their fascist dictator Salazar had fallen from power, and Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and East Timor were all given their freedom. Mozambique at the time was the poorest country on earth. Their first president had worked in a hospital. He had beautiful ideas about healthcare. So from there, I went to Mozambique and started working. At the time of independence for Mozambique, most of the Portuguese doctors fled. A country of 15 million people with maybe 20 doctors. When I got there, they gave me an entire district for myself. 200,000 people, one doctor. Go do something up in the mountains. This was a huge challenge, and yet this country was free and determined to make the best of their situation. One minor problem. Bordering Mozambique at the time, Rhodesia and South Africa, both of which practiced apartheid. They could not tolerate seeing a multinational government with a black president as a neighbor. So after about a year, counter-coup activities took place, and it was very brutal. I worked there for 3 years, and towards the end, it became impossible to accomplish anything because they used landmines, and you couldn't go anywhere. My cohorts were being killed around the country, and it was impossible to do any medical work. So from there, I came back, worked in the United States for a while with stints in other countries, including Nicaragua, Laos, India, visited Cuba. But then a big opportunity presented itself. It was called East Timor. I had always heard about their story. I knew about the Portuguese legacy. I knew what was going on. And I always thought, if anyone ever deserved some help, it should be East Timor. Not only because they were suffering so much, but that much of the suffering was due to the Western world, including my own country, backing Indonesia. Towards the end of the Indonesian time here, when President Suharto fell from power, I decided to come to East Timor. The first 2 years here, the place was occupied by Kopassus. I was running like a MASH unit, taking care of wounded people, machete wounds, massacre victims, and then also very active role in reporting to the media, which was at our clinic every day, because that's where the wounded were. I was not popular with the Indonesian government. Yes, we accomplished a lot medically, and we continue to do a lot medically now, but the thing that really stands out and what made this so important was a country of half of one island up against the fourth largest country on earth, backed by all the superpowers, was able to achieve self-determination, independence. That in itself is a miracle that made me feel like all my efforts were worth it. My message to people is, be bold, Do your homework. Figure out where you could go that you have the potential of a big impact. Consider your own skills, how you might participate. Don't look for someplace that's going to be a fun place to be. Look for where, with hard work, you can actually accomplish something. In the end, what we would like to see is people with less suffering, people with respect and self-determination, and finally, people with a certain amount of dignity in their lives. Thank you.